This week on Life and Faith.
Don't be overwhelmed by numbers. You cannot change the whole world, but you can change the whole world for one person.
Dementia does much more than simply affect memories.
There are about 500 people at the moment who are cryogenically frozen.
We all share the same public space.
I was a kind of classic bookworm when I was a kid.
Learn how to be alone.
Welcome to Life and Faith from CPX. I'm Simon Smart. In this job, you sometimes get to meet people who live lives that make you want to stop and reassess everything. Apparently saintly people, or at least people who act in very saintly ways. And these moments can be a bit confronting, but also really inspiring. And I hope you'll feel that today with my guest. Dr. Tertius Venter is a plastic reconstructive surgeon who over 20 years ago went on a volunteering mission to the Gambia in West Africa, where a hospital ship was working with the poorest of poor people, providing medical care, and where he was able to contribute surgical care. And in a way, he never recovered from that experience. He returned a different person, so animated by both the incredible need that he saw, but also the difference he was able to make in people's lives. For many years now, he has been a volunteer at two organisations, Cure and the Mercy Ships, providing medical aid to people who are in desperate need of that. And as you'll hear, faith has been a huge part of his journey. One of the reminders today is how much we take for granted the medical care available in prosperous nations, and also the world of difference that medical help transported literally to places of need can make. The story of the Mercy Ships is one we want to tell, so my first question to Tertius Venter was seeking to get to know that work. What are the Mercy Ships and what do they do? Here's Tertius.
So Mercy Ships is at the moment a fleet of hospitals, as you said, that started in 1979 as a single ship. Really a ship that was scrapped and then bought up by YWAM Youth with a Mission and changed into a hospital ship and just grew into at the moment they've got two very big, very modern ships. And what they are is they're hospital ships with a complete hospital on board, serving the poorest of the poor in different parts of the world. And the last 2 decades, mainly in Africa and mainly West Africa, but also in Madagascar. So they reach out to these countries for about 10 months at a time, spend a good time with the country, serving the people, but also collaborating with the departments of health and try to have an input into the health systems of the country.
Yes, and so people are coming to the ship with great need and they're being serviced there in ways that they wouldn't have access to otherwise, and it's all provided for them for free. Is that right?
That's correct. Just some interesting things is that 5 billion people, the world population is 8 billion. 5 billion people has got no access to safe, affordable, timely surgery. And 2 billion people has access to absolutely no surgery whatsoever. And the problem with that is that you get a small tumor that starts grows somewhere in your body, where you can let your general practitioner remove it for you. But if it keeps on growing for years, it becomes a big problem and it can become life-threatening. So a simple condition can become life-threatening and actually kill people simply because they don't have access to surgery.
And so this is, as you say, serving places like Senegal, Congo, Sierra Leone, these sorts of places. What are the kinds of conditions typically are you seeing on the boats themselves? So you've mentioned things like tumours that grow. What other sorts of things do you often see?
Yeah, there's 6 main specialities that the ship is involved in. The one is head and neck surgery or maxillofacial surgery. And then plastic surgery, reconstructive plastic surgery, where I am involved. In my speciality, about half the patients would be burn contractures. So where a patient has been burned, has had no access to treatment for their burns, and they end up with severe deformities because of the burn and because of the lack of access to care. They end up with either limbs that's not functional or severe facial deformities that exclude them from functioning normal in society. Then there's also general surgery. We do mainly goiters and hernias. The orthopedic surgery that they do on the ship. There's eye surgery, so they do lots of cataracts, which is interesting that a patient can be blind and within 20, 30-minute surgery under local anesthetic, they get their vision back.
It's amazing work. I guess to a large degree, the conditions themselves are a function of being poor and not having access to medical help.
Yeah, exactly. If we can take just burn injuries as an example, burn contractures, in other words, deformities as a result of a burn, is actually a condition of poor countries. It's because there's a lack of electricity in the areas, so the patients make fire in their homes for cooking and for heating, and then they get a burn, and then they can go nowhere where they burn. So a burn that might be superficial and with the correct treatment might be healed within 2-3 weeks, end up getting infected, and then months of slow healing and painful healing, and then they end up with a total deformity of a limb that's not functional, sometimes 2 or 3 limbs that's not functional. And then we can restore that function for them. So it starts because there's just basic needs not fulfilled, like electricity, that they don't have, and they end up with a severe deformity that's with them the rest of their lives, and unless someone comes in and do something about it for them.
Lots of children in this situation, I imagine.
Yes, for my patients that I treat on the ship, about 50%, up to 60% are children that end up with these deformities and then come to us for help.
And is the sort of help you can give them, particularly in your area where you're dealing with people with these burns and, as you say, the contractions, can you do much to help them? Can it change their situation particularly?
Yeah, it certainly helps them a lot. We can have a limb that's totally functionless for them and give them good function back. We always go into the field with a very good rehabilitation team of at least 4 to 5 people that include hand therapists, occupational therapists, physical therapists. And they will follow these patients up for at least 3 months with exercises, with splints, with pressure garments, and they won't be discharged before they're completely healed and their function has been restored. So one can really make a big difference in these people's lives.
Yes, it sounds absolutely amazing. And you go for a stint, like a 6-week period, for instance, at a time, and you've been doing this work for over 20 years. You've really gotten hooked by the sound of it.
Yes, I go at least twice a year, and I go for 2 months at a time, so that's 4 months. Yeah. And then I spend another 4 months with another organization, which is Cure Hospitals, which are children hospitals in Africa, treating mainly orthopedic and plastic surgical cases of children. So it's a total of 8 months of the year. And I started going in the year 2000, when one of the ships, the oldest ship, the original ship, came to our port where I was in private practice as a plastic surgeon. And I heard what they were doing, and I just felt deep in my heart, God is calling me to go and see what these people are doing. And on my very first visit, I had such a strong call from God to actually close my practice and start doing it full time.
That sounded like a very dramatic moment for you, and a personally very impactful thing. You had as you say, a successful practice presumably in a reasonably well-to-do area of your city, and now you've let that go and you're a full-time volunteer. Did it take you long to become convicted of that, or was this quite a quick thing once you saw the work and what was possible?
My very first visit was just for 10 days, and that was in the Gambia in West Africa. It was like an exploratory mission for myself, just to see what is going on these ships. And then just meeting all those Christians. These ships has got between 300 and 500 people on the ship, all volunteers. And just to see the love that they treat these people with. And at that stage, everybody had to pay their own way to get to the ship, pay crew fees to work on the ship. and to see how committed these people were and how they treated these patients with all the love in their hearts just because they want to do it. And then for myself, observing the poverty that I saw in those countries that I never knew existed on our planet, and sitting in front of a patient face to face and just thinking, what's the difference between me and you? The only difference is where I was born and where you were born. And neither of us had any say in that. So I was just in an unbelievable privileged position, working as a plastic surgeon with a wonderful family, had all the material possessions that I had, and I sit in front of someone who's got nothing and then has this burden of disease on their lives that they are suffering with, and they can go nowhere with that. And I really just had that realization that God was blessing me so I could bless other people. And it was really within a day that I just knew I just can't carry on as I have been. There is too much need in the world, and God's presence just filled me so much, and His love and peace filled me so much that it wasn't for me really a decision to take. It was just something that I knew I had to do. I didn't even have to think about it. I just went home, started talking to my family and said, God is calling me to do this full time. There's just so much need in the world.
So you didn't experience that, therefore, as a heavy burden? You felt it was something that was a exciting prospect?
It was exciting, but obviously, to go home, and my wife wasn't with me, and I had to go home and tell her suddenly my double-story house on a river and my holiday cottage and my boat that I had, all those things suddenly had no meaning anymore for me. I really met God face to face, and I was filled with His presence, with who He is. And just in those circumstances of these people with this absolute need, that for me, it wasn't a question. I just wanted to go and know I am where God wants me. But obviously, for my family, it was almost a foreigner that came home. I was a different person. And that took a while. And God also made it clear to me, just wait until your family is adjusted to the idea that everything is in place. My children were at school still. And it took 6 years before I felt in 2006 that God said, okay, now it's time. Close your practice and go full-time and do this as a full-time volunteer.
Yes, you certainly haven't stopped working. It sounds like you've been working very hard in this task.
Yeah, we certainly on the ship, my working hours is anything from 12 to 14 to 16 hours a day. We work really hard there because we just try to give the best to our patients and do as many patients as possible.
From what I can tell, some of the surgery you're able to do is relatively straightforward, but some of it's extremely complex, and that must be challenging in any situation, but perhaps even more so in that one. Tell me a bit about that and the team that you have around you of people who are similarly committed.
Yeah, so the problem obviously is if you see someone who's had a tumor growing in the face or anywhere in the body and it's been growing there for 5 or 10 years, it becomes very complicated to remove those tumors because they keep on growing. They sometimes, like the neurofibromas, start infiltrating into the deep tissues, and it becomes a severe problem and a really complicated procedure to remove it. And often when we remove these big tumors, you sit with a very big hole that needs to be covered. So we also do microsurgical free flaps where we can take tissues from one part of the body and transfer it, and then to cover the defect or to reconstruct the defect. And those surgeries can take anything from 8 to 15, 16 hours. So it's just wonderful that the people that come to the ship, the nurses, the anaesthetists, everybody, they're all really committed to help people. They're there for one reason, and that is to serve people and to serve God. And just to work with such a wide variety of people, there's often up to 40 different nationalities on the ship. And it's amazing that we all have the same goal in mind, how we can work within a week or two that we're on the ship and we can work together because we've got one goal in mind, and that is to help these people. And it just always amazes me how well it works out, that you can work with a complete new team, and within a couple of days we just work together and go for what we know we need to do.
This is Life and Faith, and I'm speaking with Tertius Venter, who's coming to us from Cape Town. He's telling his story of working as a reconstructive surgeon on the Mercy ships, mostly in Africa, and the work they do there and the difference it makes to poor people's lives. I next asked him what the best part of his job is. Here's what he had to say.
Oh, that's easy to say. The best part of my job is going back into the wards and see the smiles on the people's faces, the patients that we've treated. Because especially the children, they remember their burn injury and how long it took and all the pain of the dressing changes that the mothers would do and put whatever they could on to get the wounds healed. So they've gone through pain for weeks, if not months. And then they come onto this big white ship with all these foreign faces and they're scared, but then just through the love that they experience on the ship and the surgeries that we try to do as pain-free as possible. And we really limit the pain by all sorts of means, local blocks, regional blocks, good analgesia. And then within a week, maybe 10 days, and they realize they can see their limbs are now in a different position. And then to see them running up and down in the wards, just laughing and playing. That is really the biggest reward for us. It's really to put smiles on the hearts and faces of people. And when you see that, there's no bigger reward than that.
Yeah, I wonder if you could comment on that dynamic of this sort of commitment to people in great need, but the satisfaction that it brings you, but also the people around you. That's a huge part, I imagine, of what goes on there.
I mean, our goal is obviously to bring people healing that they otherwise just would never have. So it's an opportunity for them to have the disease stopped, or if they have a deformity, to have it corrected. People come with a tumor that starts growing and they don't know what is this thing growing in their face and how long it will grow and will it kill them. That uncertainty of what is this, and often feel and be blamed that they are cursed, that's why they have it. Or a mother that's bringing in a child with a cleft lip, and she feels guilty because people said she's done something wrong, and that's why the child has got this cleft lip. And to touch them and tell them, you have done nothing wrong. There's nothing you could have done that caused this cleft lip. But we can repair it for the child and offer him a normal life ahead. And to see the mother's relief under those circumstances, and then obviously the children as well, because they often get ostracized because of their deformities. They get mocked. Parents sometimes just hide the children out of sight of other people. But this just gives them the dignity of being human back and say, you are important in our sight, you're important in God's sight, and that's why we would just want to restore normality for you.
I understand that not only are you and your team performing these very important surgeries, but while you're doing it, you're training people who will be able to go out and do that work elsewhere. And so it's sort of a multiplier effect of good work. Is that what's happening there?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. If we just look at some numbers, in the United States, there are 53 surgeons per 100,000 population. In Australia, there's 44 surgeons per 100,000. In Africa, there's 1. So they've got a huge need for surgeons. And the problem also there that many of these surgeons are in the cities and patients is to pay to see them. So for the general population, for 90% of the population, they've got no access to any surgery. So the ship is very much involved in training not only of surgeons, but also of anaesthetists and of nursing care, of radiology care for the patients. So they've got different programs that's been developed over the last few years, getting the local healthcare workers onto the ship and also reaching out to their hospitals and getting involved in their training programs to establish better training and better facilities for these patients. So it's not only training, it also helps them to improve their facilities that they have available for themselves. And that is a program that's in development now and has been going on for a couple of years, so that when the ship leaves, they leave skills behind.
People come with all sorts of different, you have surgeons, nurses, anaesthetists, these sorts of things. Can people go and work on the Mercy ships who don't have those medical skills? Are there things that need doing?
Absolutely. You know, the ship is like a small town. You know, whatever you think is in a town is on the ship. There's a coffee shop, there's a library, there's a school, because there are families who come who commit for 1 or 2 or 3 years. So there's a school with about 50 children on the ship. So they need teachers. There's engineers that's needed. There are plumbers that's needed. There's electricians that's needed. There's people, you know, if you think there are 400 people on the ship, plus the patients, plus day workers, they prepare 600-700 meals 3 times a day. So there's people who need to prepare those meals and serve the meals. So whatever you can think about in a small town, that is what we need on the ship. So there's work for anybody who wants to volunteer and get involved.
Well, it's interesting because the way we were put in touch with each other was through a friend, my friend Ali, who's been on the Mercy ship, who's come back to Australia, is training to be a nurse. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if she ended up back there at some point.
Yeah, I'm trying hard to encourage her to keep on with her studies and get back on the ship. And she worked there as a hairdresser. So as I said, anything that you have in a small town will be on the ship. So there's hairdressers as well. Any possible job that people need to do in a role in a normal town will be on the ship.
Can you tell me about, I mean, this might be hard to do, but over this long career you've had in working in these areas, are there people who stand out in your memory or moments that were particularly impacting of you and personally memorable?
You know, one can take very complicated surgeries that we could help people, or less complicated cases. One that I can remember, and that was on my very first visit in 2000. The ship's security now is very high and very strict. You won't get near to the ship without the necessary permission. But in those days, it was still quite easy. So when I was in the Gambia and I was already packed and ready to leave the ship to go back home to South Africa, I walked down the gangway towards the dock, and there was a young man standing. He was about 21, 22, with a cleft lip. And he could just come to the ship, and he stood there and he said, "Is there somebody that can help me with my lip?" I looked at my watch and I thought, I still have time to do him. And I ran up back to the OR. I said, "There's a young man here outside who needs his lip repaired. He's old enough to be done under local. Can I quickly do it before I leave?" And they said, "Sure, bring him on." And I took him in. We put him on the table, put local anesthetic in, repaired his lip. So that young man came, he was walking his whole life with this horrible looking face, coming to the ship just hoping that maybe there's some help for him. And 2 hours later, his lip was repaired. And I just think that was such a life-changing experience for him. And that is all it needs. Often, you know, I also work with Operation Smile that does cleft lip and palates worldwide. We often see people that's 50, 60, 70 years old, their whole lives walking around with these cleft lip and palates. And all it takes is 45 minutes under local anesthetic. We just need people to do that. You know, to give up of one's personal time and just realize there are millions and millions of people. You know, just on reconstructive plastic surgery, they estimate that there are at least 5 million shortfall in procedures of just reconstructive plastic surgery. Every year, there's 5 million people that need surgery that won't get it because they just don't have access to what they need. So the need is massively worldwide.
Does the scale of that ever feel overwhelming to you to the extent that it's a bit depressing?
Oh, yes. And I've often asked that question, what can I do? And there's quite a few quotes. The one I can quote Mother Teresa, who just said, don't be overwhelmed by numbers. Do the one that's in front of you and do the next one. And Dr. Gary Parker, who's been on the ship his whole life, a maxillofacial surgeon, he always said, you cannot change the whole world, but you can change the whole world for one person, and the next, and the next, and the next. So if we just concentrate on the one that we can help and not say, well, there are just so many, I'm not going to do anything, but say, this one I can help, and this one is the next one I can help. And the more of us who's prepared to do that, the more people will be helped. Instead of standing back and say, there's just too many, just forget about it. One's got to know that you change the lives and the whole world for those single people.
Do you ever get to see people down the track and how their life has changed?
Yes, from time to time. And just one person came to mind now. And that was an anaesthetist that worked on the ship. And he went to Sierra Leone to visit previous patients that he has seen. And when he got out the airport, someone recognized him sitting in a truck, driving a truck. And he jumped out of the truck and ran up to him and said, you know what, you from Mercy Ships. And I had an arm that was burnt and had a contracture, and I could never get a job. But after you corrected this deformity of my arm, I could go and get a license, and now I'm a truck driver. And we don't often get that back because, you lose contact with the patients. But just to see those things coming back at you and realize you've really made a change in those people's lives.
No, that's amazing. Now, you're a Christian believer. So Jesus called his followers to act out, in a way, his mercy and his compassion for people, to be, in a sense, his hands and his feet, serving people in need. Would you describe that as a satisfying life, this one that you've embraced?
I think for me, if I think back of my experience those first 10 days on the ship, it was a very intense time with God. And I experienced his love and his presence in my life in a way that I never realized was possible. It was so intense. And from that moment, his love and his presence is what compels me to carry on every day. It is my closeness to God and my experiences of his closeness that is just more important than anything else in my life. And knowing if I do this work, I'm actually in the center of his will in my life, which drives me just closer to who he is and to just the wonderfulness of God himself that I can experience on a daily basis. And that is what keeps on driving me. And then just see how he provides for my family, how he provides for us in different ways, emotional ways, but also financially. He just keeps on providing so that I can have enough money without working for money, but have enough to carry on with my work, and I don't have to worry. I always tell people, when I was in private practice as a plastic surgeon, I worried much more about money and whether I will have enough for this or that. But since I know God promised me he will provide, I just never worry about money because I know it will come in when I need it.
I wonder if your experiences with the very poorest people and your experiences in the affluent countries that you've had other experiences in, what's that done for you in terms of your perspective on poverty and riches, and where those two very different worlds interact with each other?
I think it's important to know that there's enough wealth in the world for everybody to be comfortable. But 90% of the world's wealth is in 10% of the people of this world's hands. So people are just holding their wealth to themselves, and the rest of the world suffers under that. And I think, going into these areas and just see how hard it is for people to make a living, but still, we see so much joy in people's lives, although they live on $1 a day or $2 a day. When you talk to them, there's no feeling of depression or sense of hopelessness. They live from day to day, and I often find that they are more happy in themselves than people in big cities with lots of money who's got to worry about all the things that's going on in their lives and all their possessions, what's going to happen to their investments, and just worries about all these different things. While people with much less can be much happier. At the same time, those people also need schools and education. They need health care because people die at very young ages and they suffer unnecessarily because there's no health care for them. So one's got to bring the wealth into those countries, not to make them happier, but to give them a fair share of what we have in this world. And that is, we need to bring good education. We need to bring good health care into the countries. And that is also what Ships is trying to do, is not only to bring the physical operation to people, but to bring skills into those countries. So they've got big programs of training and involving local healthcare workers in our work. And we're doing that more and more. And many organizations are doing that by training surgeons in Africa.
This has been Life and Faith with me, Simon Smart. Thank you to Dr. Tertius Venter for being willing to tell us about his work and his story. You can find out more about Tertius from his website or on Instagram, and we'll put links to those in the show notes. Also about Mercy Ships and Cure, which he mentioned as the two charities he currently works for, 4 months at a time. Maybe you have some skills you could take to the Mercy Ships. I'm sure your life would never be the same again. Please send this episode to someone you think might be interested. I'm sure you know many who would fit that category. And thanks as always to our producer, the compassionate and very practical Alan Douthwaite. Next week.
Prior to the Paralympics being in Sydney, we'd never seen anyone with a disability in mainstream media. Like that name Louise Savage, who lit the torch for the Paralympics, she became a household name. That was in Paralympics where we had a very young Kurt Fearnley and a very, very young Dylan Alcott. But that put some impressions in their minds as well of what was possible.